They told you the ocean was a European invention, tall ships, brave explorers, blank maps waiting to be filled, a world sitting still until someone from Europe decided to move. That story sounds heroic. It's also false, because long before Europe trusted open water, Africans were already moving across it. Not drifting, not guessing, navigating, building, trading, returning. The sea wasn't a mystery to Africa, it was a road. Here's the contrast nobody prepares you for. When Europe still hugged coastlines in fear of the horizon, Africa was already designing vessels meant for distance. Not rivers, not lakes. Distance. The kind that assumes land exists beyond what the eye can see. That matters, because you don't build for distance unless you expect arrival. This wasn't luck, it was confidence. The Nile alone forces engineering. You don't master that river without understanding currents, weight distribution, materials, and timing. African boat builders weren't improvising. They were refining. Papyrus vessels reinforced for endurance. Wooden ships with steering systems. Hulls designed for control, not survival. And that knowledge didn't stay inland. It moved outward. Africa sits between oceans. The Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Atlantic. These weren't barriers. They were connectors. And Africans used them early. Trade routes didn't magically appear in Europe and spread outward. They formed where movement already existed, where navigation was already practiced, which explains something that never gets asked. Why do ancient trade networks point toward Africa instead of away from it? Gold, salt, copper, ivory, textiles, ideas. You don't sustain global exchange without reliable travel, and reliable travel doesn't come from fear, it comes from mastery. Yet when history is told, African movement gets minimized, rebranded as local, accidental, coastal. Meanwhile, European voyages get framed as bold leaps into the unknown. But ask yourself this: if Africans weren't navigating early, why do foreign records keep describing African ships, African sailors, African ports? Why do ancient writers outside Africa reference African seafaring as established, not experimental? Because by the time others noticed, Africa was already in motion. Now here's where the story tightens. Exploration isn't just about where you went, it's about whether you came back. African voyages weren't one-way legends. They were part of systems. Trade implies return. Exchange implies continuity. That alone separates exploration from accident. And that's what makes the erasure deliberate, because once you admit Africans mastered boats and navigation early, the timeline collapses. The idea that exploration flows one direction, from Europe outward, stops working. So the narrative had to shift. Africa became landlocked in the imagination, deserted, isolated, waiting, as if oceans conveniently forgot to touch its shores. That image didn't come from evidence, it came from necessity, because modern power narratives depend on firsts. First explorers, first maps, first connections. If Africans were already moving globally, then later discoveries aren't discoveries, they're arrivals. And nobody wants to be second in a story built on dominance. So African seafaring gets reframed as primitive. Boats become rafts. Voyages become theories. Evidence becomes debated. But notice something. European claims get celebrated even when evidence is thin. African claims get interrogated even when evidence stacks up. That's not skepticism. That's bias with a ruler, and it shapes how people see capability. Because once you remove African movement, you remove African agency. You turn a continent of travelers into a place people travel to. That psychological shift matters. It makes Africa passive in world history, reactive, late. And once that idea sets in, everything else follows. So here's the real question. This chunk is asking, why does the world feel so comfortable imagining Africans as stationary when the evidence says movement was foundational? Why do boats built by Africans get minimized while later versions get mythologized? Why is African navigation always framed as possible, while European navigation is framed as inevitable? Those aren't accidents of storytelling, they're choices. Because if Africans traveled the world first, intentionally, repeatedly, skillfully, then global history didn't begin with Europe stepping outward. It began with Africa already in motion. And once you accept that, the next question becomes unavoidable. If Africans were already navigating oceans, who exactly was being discovered? If Africans didn't travel far, the evidence should stop at the shoreline. It doesn't. Across ancient maps, foreign texts, and material finds, Africa shows up not as a destination, but as a source. Start with maps. Early Mediterranean and Middle Eastern charts don't treat Africa as unknown. Coastlines are traced, ports are named, routes are assumed. You don't map what nobody uses, you map what's active. Then there are records. Writers from outside Africa repeatedly describe African sailors as experienced, not curious novices. Experienced. That word matters. Experience implies repetition, generations, systems already in place, and the materials back it up. African shipbuilding wasn't crude. It was specialized. Different waters demanded different designs. Rivercraft, coastal vessels, open sea ships. That level of variation only exists where travel is normal. Now pause. If Africans were behind, why were their boats adapted to multiple environments before Europe standardized anything beyond coastal sailing? That contradiction never gets resolved in textbooks. Instead, it gets ignored. Then there's trade scale. You move heavy commodities long distances without maritime reliability. Gold doesn't float itself. Salt doesn't drift across seas. Someone moves it intentionally over and over. Africa wasn't exporting myths. It was exporting materials that built empires elsewhere. And those routes didn't magically start when Europeans arrived. They were already active. Europeans didn't invent the lanes. They entered them. That's the uncomfortable part. Because joining an existing network doesn't make you the pioneer. It makes you a late adopter. And once again, the language shifts. African navigation becomes regional. European navigation becomes global. Same waters, same distances, different labels. Why? Because global carries prestige, and prestige gets assigned, not earned. There's another clue people skip. If Africans weren't capable of long-range travel, why did outsiders seek African pilots? You don't hire navigators from a place with no navigation tradition. You recruit expertise where it already exists. That fact alone dismantles the myth, yet it's rarely said out loud, because saying it forces a rewrite. It forces acknowledgement that African knowledge didn't just stay home. It guided others outward, and that flips the hierarchy. So instead of asking whether Africans could travel the world, ask this instead. Why is there so much effort spent proving they didn't? That kind of resistance only appears when the answer threatens the story. Because if African sailors were already mapping, trading, navigating, then the age of exploration wasn't a beginning. It was a takeover of routes that already worked, and that's a very different legacy. Next, the most explosive part, the journeys that weren't just trade, but contact. Contact so far from Africa that it forces historians to squirm. Trade is easy to dismiss. Contact isn't, because contact leaves fingerprints in places where excuses run out. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. Look west. Long before Europe framed the Atlantic as a wall, African sailors treated it like a road. Seasonal currents, predictable winds, repeatable returns. This wasn't guesswork. It was pattern recognition, the foundation of ocean travel. You don't accidentally cross oceans and come back. You plan it. There are accounts, not African myths, but foreign records, describing Africans arriving by sea in places they shouldn't have been. Not blown off course, not stranded, arriving, with goods, with knowledge, with intent. And here's the detail people gloss over. These weren't lone adventurers. They were organized voyages, crews, supplies, timing. No civilization stumbles into that. Then there's the physical evidence nobody wants to argue with. African crops appearing outside Africa before European expansion, not centuries later, earlier. Plants don't migrate on ideology. They move with people who know how to grow them. That means contact wasn't theoretical. It was lived. And once again, the language gets slippery. Instead of asking how Africans traveled so far, the question becomes whether the evidence is conclusive enough. As if European records weren't accepted with far less scrutiny, same standards aren't applied, because applying them evenly creates a problem. If Africans reached distant lands independently, then exploration wasn't a European awakening, it was an interruption. That's why these stories get labeled controversial, not because they lack evidence, but because they lack permission. Now consider this. If African sailors were already moving between continents, exchanging goods, mapping waters, and returning home, what does that say about African technological capability? It destroys the idea of isolation. It destroys the idea of stagnation. It destroys the idea of dependence. And that's exactly why this part gets buried. Because once you accept early African contact, everything else has to be reconsidered. Who taught whom? Who followed whose routes? Who actually knew the oceans? That's the question nobody wants to answer. So instead, the narrative shifts again. African presence becomes coincidence. Artifacts become anomalies. Records become misinterpretations, not disproven, just softened. But history doesn't work on vibes. Patterns matter, and the pattern is consistent. Wherever long-distance maritime knowledge appears later, Africa was already there earlier, not chasing, not copying, leading. Which brings us to the final layer people avoid. If Africans were early global travelers, then the story of discovery isn't about courage, it's about control. Control of credit, control of narrative, control of who gets remembered, because you can dominate land and still lose history. And Africa did, not because it lacked achievement, but because others wrote the textbooks. So the real question isn't whether Africans traveled the world first. The evidence keeps stacking. The real question is this: what else had to be erased to make the modern story make sense? Because once the ocean stopped being European property, the entire timeline collapses. And when timelines collapse, so do myths. Next, the technology itself. The ships, the knowledge, and the systems that made early African exploration not just possible, but inevitable. The lie isn't that Africans lacked ships. The lie is pretending ships only count if Europe built them. African maritime technology didn't look like European caravels because it didn't need to. Different waters, different priorities. Same outcome, distance conquered. West African vessels were engineered for open water and rivers, wide hulls, stabilized frames, sail systems designed for Atlantic winds, not pretty museum pieces, functional machines. And here's the part people ignore: navigation. Africans weren't guessing direction. They tracked stars, sun angles, wind cycles, ocean currents. Generational knowledge passed orally, refined through repetition. You don't need compasses if you understand the sky. You don't need maps if you know patterns. Europe learned this later. Africa already lived it. This wasn't luck-based sailing. It was systems-based travel. And systems don't appear overnight. They require time, trial, failure, correction. Which means long-distance African travel wasn't a one-off event. It was routine. That's why European observers later described African sailors with surprise, not disbelief. They saw skill. They just didn't credit it, because credit creates hierarchy. And hierarchy was already decided. So instead of acknowledging African maritime science, the narrative shrank it, localized it, framed it as coastal knowledge, as if oceans start somewhere else. But water doesn't care who names it. If you can leave shore and return on schedule, you own the sea. And Africans did, which creates a final problem. If African technology was sufficient and African knowledge was advanced, then the rise of European naval dominance wasn't innovation, it was takeover. And that reframes everything, because conquest looks heroic only when you pretend no one was there before. Next, what happened when Europeans followed African routes, then rewrote the story after? Europe didn't suddenly figure out the oceans. It followed paths already known. When European sailors began pushing down the African coast, they weren't entering mystery. They were entering traffic, established currents, seasonal wind cycles Africans already understood. The Atlantic isn't random. It's a system. And Africans had mapped that system long before Europe trusted open water. That's why early European voyages hugged African shores. They relied on African pilots, African ports, African knowledge of when to sail and when not to die. This part gets skipped on purpose because discovery sounds heroic. Learning from Africans doesn't. European logs quietly admit it. Coastal stops weren't just resupply points, they were classrooms. Europeans observed ship design, sail angles, hull balance, navigation timing. Then they standardized it, renamed it, claimed it. Same ocean, same winds, different flag. And once Europe could repeat the journey without African help, the story changed. Routes became European discoveries. Maps erased African contributions. Navigation manuals pretended knowledge appeared fully formed. That's not innovation, that's extraction. And extraction always rewrites history afterward. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If Africans had not already mastered Atlantic movement, European expansion would have stalled. No shortcuts, no safe return paths, no predictable trade winds, no empire. Europe didn't conquer the seas by genius alone. It scaled knowledge it didn't create. And that explains why African maritime history disappears right when European naval power rises. You can't admit inheritance if you want supremacy. So Africa's role gets minimized to local travel. Europe gets credited with global exploration. Same waters, different storytelling. Next, the physical evidence that refuses to disappear even after the story was rewritten. Africans didn't wait for Europeans to invent ships. They already had them. Not rafts, not shoreline canoes, ocean-capable vessels built for distance, cargo, and return journeys. Sewn plank ships, reed boats reinforced for waves, multi-oared craft designed for stability, not luck. This matters, because oceans don't forgive amateurs. You don't cross currents, survive storms, and come back alive by accident. You do it with design, repetition, and accumulated knowledge. That's why African boats show up everywhere Europeans later claim as first. Contact. Mediterranean reliefs show African sailors centuries before Rome dominated the sea. West African river systems supported shipbuilding industries, not hobbies. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was a training ground for maritime engineering, and Africans didn't stop at rivers. They pushed outward. West African currents naturally carry vessels toward the Americas. That's not theory, that's physics. The same currents Columbus later used were already flowing. Africans didn't need compasses to feel them. They learned them through experience. This is where historians get nervous, because if Africans could build boats and read oceans, then isolation myths collapse. Africa wasn't waiting to be connected. It was already connected. The reason this isn't emphasized is simple. Shipbuilding equals capability. Capability equals agency. Agency ruins the story of Africa as passive, so the boats get minimized, the technology gets downgraded, the voyages get labeled unlikely. But the ocean doesn't care about labels. It only responds to skill, and Africans had it. Next, why the strongest evidence isn't written records at all, but what turned up on the other side of the ocean. If Africans crossed oceans, traces would remain. They did. Not myths, not legends. Physical markers that shouldn't exist, yet do. In the Americas, early European observers recorded African-looking people already there. Dark skin, tightly coiled hair, facial structures they explicitly described as African. Not imagined, written down. But written records get dismissed. Artifacts don't. Botanists found African crops in the Americas before European contact. Bottle gourds, cotton varieties. Plants don't swim across oceans alone. They arrive with people who know how to cultivate them. Then there's metallurgy. Ironworking techniques in parts of the Americas mirror West African methods, not European ones. Same furnace logic, same shaping. Approach. Independent invention is possible. Identical systems across oceans are not coincidence. And then the currents again. Because whatever leaves West Africa doesn't just drift anywhere. It arrives exactly where these traces appear. Same landing zones, same coastal corridors. That alignment matters. You can ignore one clue, you can argue two. But when geography, biology, technology, and eyewitness accounts all point the same direction, denial becomes policy, not skepticism. Which is why this evidence rarely makes it into classrooms, because admitting Africans explored first doesn't just change a date, it changes the hierarchy. Next, why this history wasn't forgotten, but actively pushed out once Europe needed a different origin story. Once Europe began expanding, African first contact became a liability. You can't claim discovery if someone arrived before you. You can't claim superiority if the uncivilized mastered oceans first. So the story shifted. African voyages were rebranded as drift. Navigation became accidental. Evidence was labeled anomalous, not disproven, downgraded. Maps tell this clearly. Medieval maps show Africa accurately mapped long before Europe understood its own coastlines. Sea routes from Africa appear precise. Europe's? Guesswork. That's not coincidence, that's experience. African mariners didn't hug shorelines. They understood stars, currents, wind cycles. They planned crossings. They returned. That's navigation, not luck. But when Europe standardized history, only one group could be framed as explorers. Everyone else became background noise. So African seafaring was stripped of intent, because intent implies intelligence, and intelligence threatens the narrative. Next, the moment Europe officially rewrote exploration history and locked Africans out of the record. Europe didn't just rewrite history, they legislated it. Once maritime empires formed, exploration became a state-controlled weapon. Charters, patents, papal decrees, only European crowns were authorized to discover land. If Africans reached somewhere first, it didn't count, not because it was false, because it wasn't European. The doctrine of discovery didn't ask who arrived first. It asked who claimed it under European law. That's how African voyages vanished without being disproven. Next, the physical evidence that survived anyway, buried in plain sight. Here's the part they never accounted for. Even when stories are buried, objects don't lie. Across the Atlantic world, physical evidence keeps breaking the script Europe wrote. Let's start with metallurgy. Long before European arrival in the Americas, advanced ironworking appears in regions that had no known local development path for it. The techniques match West and Central African metallurgy, not European medieval methods. Same carbon ratios, same smelting styles, same tools. That's not coincidence. That's transfer. Then there's language. Certain indigenous American words for metals, tools, and navigation have no roots in European languages, but they align closely with West African linguistic structures, not identical, aligned, meaning contact happened long enough ago for adaptation, not copying. That requires time and repeated interaction. Now look at agriculture. Crops like bottle gourds appear in the Americas thousands of years before Europe's transatlantic voyages. Genetic testing shows African origins. These seeds don't float intact across oceans for thousands of miles. They're carried, protected, planted. That's travel with purpose. Then there's architecture. Step pyramids appear on both sides of the Atlantic. Not identical, related. Shared principles, shared mathematics, shared orientation to stars and solstices. European scholars dismiss this as parallel development, but parallel development doesn't explain shared mistakes, or shared measurement systems, or shared cosmology. Those come from contact. Now let's talk about navigation itself. Africans weren't guessing their way across water. They tracked stars long before Europe standardized astronomy. They understood seasonal wind cycles. They mapped currents like the Canary Current and equatorial countercurrent, the same currents later used by European ships. Here's the problem for the official story. If Africans understood these systems first, then Europe didn't pioneer global navigation. They inherited it. That flips everything, which is why African maritime knowledge is never taught as a system, only as fragments. Fishing, trade, rivers, coasts, never oceans. But you don't build advanced rivercraft without understanding hydrodynamics. You don't build long-distance trade networks without logistics. And you don't develop celestial navigation accidentally. Europe documented African ships as early as the 1300s. Large vessels, organized crews, controlled voyages. But those descriptions quietly disappear from later textbooks because acknowledging them would mean Europe wasn't first. And first is the foundation of dominance. Now consider this. When Europeans arrived on African coasts, they didn't find technological inferiors. They found societies already integrated into global systems. Gold routes, salt routes, knowledge routes. That doesn't happen in isolation. Isolation produces survival. Connection produces systems. Africa had systems, which means Africa had reach. So why is this never framed as exploration? Because exploration implies agency, and agency doesn't fit the later narrative that Africa was passive, stagnant, waiting to be found. So the story was inverted. European voyages became bold. African voyages became invisible, not disproven, excluded. And once textbooks hardened, the lie became tradition. Students weren't taught African. Sailors crossed oceans. They were taught oceans separated Africa from the world. That's the trick. Separation erases responsibility. Connection creates questions. Questions like, who taught Europe how to sail long distances? Who mapped the winds? Who proved oceans could be crossed safely? Those answers threatened the hierarchy, so they were removed. But the evidence keeps resurfacing in artifacts, in genetics, in maps, in shared knowledge systems. History didn't forget African exploration. It was edited out, and editing requires intent. Which brings us to the final problem no textbook can solve. If Africans traveled the world first, if they mapped, traded, taught, and connected continents, then modern history isn't a story of European rise. It's a story of African erasure. And once you see that, the entire timeline collapses. Next, why admitting this truth changes how power, progress, and discovery are defined forever. Here's the real reason this never gets taught straight. Admitting African global travel doesn't just adjust history, it detonates it. Because the modern world is built on a sequence: discovery, expansion, authority, ownership. Remove discovery, and the rest collapses. If Africans crossed oceans first, then Europe didn't discover the world. It arrived late. And late arrivals don't get to write ownership claims. That's the core threat. History isn't neutral. It's legal scaffolding. Land claims, borders, power, prestige. Exploration is the receipt. So Europe didn't just need Africans erased as explorers. They needed Africans repositioned as stationary, local, isolated, cut off. That's why African history gets framed as inland kingdoms and deserts. Never sea lanes, never open water, never global. Because global implies parity, and parity destroys hierarchy. Once Europe crowned itself the age of exploration, everything else became secondary by default. If Africans had explored earlier, Europe's so-called golden age becomes a catch-up phase. That's unacceptable to empire. So instead, African evidence gets filtered through impossible standards. If Europeans left maps, they're proof. If Africans left oral records, they're myths. If Europeans built ships that survived in museums, they're advanced. If African ships were built for function, not preservation, they're unverified. Different rules, same evidence, opposite conclusions. That's not scholarship, that's gatekeeping. And it didn't stop at academics. Churches reinforced it, states reinforced it, publishers reinforced it. Because once history gets printed, repetition becomes truth. By the time archaeology catches up, the public is already conditioned to reject anything that disrupts the timeline they memorized, which is why African exploration evidence is always framed as controversial, even when it's physical. Coins, plants, ship descriptions, trade goods, shared technologies, all labeled debated, not because they're weak, but because they're disruptive. Now here's the part nobody likes saying out loud. If Africans were global navigators, then Africa wasn't behind, which means later domination wasn't destiny. It was force, and force needs justification. So history was clean, smooth edges, missing chapters, selective memory. Exploration became a European invention. Navigation became a European skill. The ocean became a European domain. Africa got land, Europe got the world. That division isn't natural, it's narrative. And once that narrative was set, it trained how people think today. People can imagine Africans building kingdoms. They struggle to imagine Africans commanding oceans, not because it didn't happen, because they were never shown it. That's the long-term damage. When you erase agency from the past, you cap expectations in the present. So this isn't about boats, it's about permission. Permission to lead, permission to innovate, permission to claim space. African exploration breaks the psychological ceiling, which is exactly why it stays buried. But here's the closing problem they can't solve. Erasure only works while people don't look twice. And now, people are looking. The maps are resurfacing. The artifacts are being re-examined. The genetics don't align with the story. The currents don't support accident. The ocean itself contradicts the lie because oceans reward knowledge, not luck. And repeated crossings don't happen by chance. So the question is no longer, did Africans travel the world first? The evidence already answered that. The real question is, how much of what we call history only exists because this truth was silenced? And what happens when the silence finally breaks? Let's stop circling the idea and pin it down, because the strongest evidence African exploration existed isn't theory, it's residue. History always leaves leftovers, and the leftovers don't lie. Start with the Atlantic. Long before Europe built ocean empires, West African civilizations were already shipbuilders. Not rafts, not canoes hugging shorelines, purpose-built vessels for distance, wide hulls, steering oars, sails adapted for trade winds, designs described by Arab chroniclers who had no reason to flatter Africans. Mansa Musa didn't just control gold, he controlled logistics. When Mali expanded, it didn't just move inland, it moved outward. There are records of Mali's rulers commissioning fleets, hundreds of ships, not for war, for exploration. One fleet never returned. That's not myth, that's documented loss. You don't lose a fleet unless you expect it to survive open water, and here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Across the Atlantic, before Columbus, European explorers encountered people who didn't fit the script. Descriptions of dark-skinned traders already familiar with gold. Accounts of locals wearing cotton and metallurgy techniques unknown to Europe but common in West Africa. That didn't happen randomly. Then there's agriculture. Certain African crops appear in the Americas before European contact. Not years before, centuries. Crops don't drift across oceans. People carry them. So do animals. So do technologies. So do ideas. And ideas leave patterns. Look at architecture. Look at pyramid styles in the Americas that predate European arrival but mirror African engineering logic, not European masonry. Different materials, same principles. That's transfer. Now let's talk navigation. Ocean currents are not neutral. They are highways. From West Africa, the Canary Current flows directly to the Americas. Strong, predictable, fast. Return currents flow north, then east, back to Africa. This isn't speculative. It's how Columbus made it back, which raises a question nobody wants to answer. If the currents make the journey easy and Africans lived on that coast for millennia, why assume they didn't use them? Because the assumption isn't about evidence, it's about permission. Now here's the tell. When Europeans finally reached parts of Africa's coast, they were shocked by how sophisticated maritime trade already was. Established ports, shipbuilding centers, navigational knowledge refined over generations. You don't invent that overnight. You don't suddenly become ocean capable after thousands of years of isolation. Isolation is the myth. Connection is the reality. And the proof shows up in the strangest places. Coins found in the Americas matching African metallurgy standards. Linguistic overlaps between West African languages and indigenous American terms related to trade and navigation. Genetic markers that don't line up with the official timeline. Each piece alone gets dismissed. Together, they form a diverse problem, because coincidence doesn't repeat this cleanly. So what does the system do? It fragments the evidence, keeps each discipline separate. Archaeology doesn't talk to linguistics. Linguistics doesn't talk to genetics. Genetics doesn't talk to oceanography, but when you put them in the same room, the story changes. African sailors weren't anomalies, they were participants. Participants in a connected world that existed long before Europe declared itself global. And that's the part that hits hardest. The world was already networked, already exchanging, already moving. Europe didn't open the world, it inserted itself into an existing one, which means first contact isn't first, it's first control. And control rewrites memory. That's why African navigation gets framed as unlikely, why ships are minimized, why records are called exaggerations. Because once Africans are acknowledged as global actors, the hierarchy flips. Now let's be clear. This isn't about claiming Africans went everywhere before everyone. It's about rejecting the lie that they went nowhere. The truth is more threatening. Africans moved, they explored, they traded, they knew the oceans, they left traces, and those traces survived erasure. Which brings us to the final barrier, because even with receipts, even with currents, even with artifacts, people still resist this truth. Not because it lacks evidence, but because accepting it changes how power is remembered. And power never gives that up willingly. So the real fight isn't over boats, it's over legacy. Who gets credited with curiosity? Who gets framed as pioneers? Who gets written as passive? African exploration disrupts the foundation story of the modern world, which is exactly why it's still treated like a rumor. But here's the catch. Rumors don't leave this much proof. So the real question isn't whether Africans traveled the world first, it's why so much energy was spent making sure you'd never seriously consider it. And once you see that pattern, what other firsts start looking suspicious? Here's where the switch happened, not by accident, by design. Once Europe began expanding outward, it needed something stronger than ships. It needed a story where exploration began with them, a story where movement equaled superiority, a story where whoever arrived last still got to claim first. So the timeline was flipped. African movement became silence. European movement became destiny. And this didn't happen in one moment. It happened through systems. Cartography came first. Maps stopped reflecting lived routes and started reflecting claims. Coastlines were exaggerated. Interior lands were emptied. Africa became a blank space unless Europe had touched it. Sea lanes that Africans used for centuries disappeared from official charts. What's not drawn stops being imagined. Then came language. African voyages were described as drift. European voyages were called navigation. Same ocean, same currents, different labels. One implies accident, the other implies mastery. That word choice did the heavy lifting. Next came chronology. European arrival was framed as the beginning of global contact. Everything before it was prehistory, even when written records existed. So African records didn't get disproven, they got disqualified. Wrong format, wrong language, wrong authors. That's how you erase without burning books. Then came institutions. Universities locked the narrative in. Museums froze it visually. Churches sanctified it spiritually. Once something gets taught in 3 places at once, it stops feeling like opinion. It becomes reality. Now here's the key move. African exploration didn't get attacked head on. It got buried under doubt. Unlikely. Debated. Fringe. That language isn't neutral. It's a warning label. It tells people not to take the idea seriously before they even hear it. And once doubt is installed, evidence has to work twice as hard. European explorers get celebrated for single voyages. Africans get dismissed despite patterns. That imbalance is intentional because patterns are dangerous. Patterns suggest systems. Systems suggest capability. Capability suggests equality. And equality breaks hierarchy. So African movement was reframed as internal. Trade became local. Knowledge became accidental. Africa was frozen in place. Europe was set in motion. That contrast shaped everything that followed. When colonial expansion happened later, it didn't look like invasion. It looked like arrival. When domination followed, it didn't look like theft. It looked like inheritance. And when violence followed, it didn't look like disruption. It looked like progress. That's the power of narrative timing. Control the beginning. You control the meaning. Now here's the irony. Europe learned navigation from the same sources it later claimed to surpass. Star charts preserved by Africans and Arabs. Wind patterns cataloged long before the so-called Age of Exploration. Ship designs adapted, not invented, but the credits were reassigned. That's the quiet trick. You don't erase the work, you change the author. By the time textbooks were standardized, the damage was permanent. African oceans became empty. European ships became heroic. The world became unknown until Europe named it. But oceans don't reset. Currents don't forget. Artifacts don't lie quietly forever. And now those cracks are visible, which is why the resistance is louder today than ever before. Because acknowledging African global movement doesn't just revise history, it reframes the present. It questions why certain nations see themselves as natural leaders, why certain people internalize limits, why innovation gets racially coded. That's why this topic still triggers discomfort. It's not about boats. It's about who gets imagined as capable of reaching beyond their shore. And here's the final twist. Once you realize African exploration was erased deliberately, you start noticing the same tactic everywhere, in science, in religion, in philosophy, in governance. African presence minimized, African agency softened, African influence detached from credit, always the same pattern. So this isn't a forgotten chapter, it's a removed one. And removed chapters usually contain something dangerous, which brings us to the next question. If African explorers moved across oceans before Europe crowned itself global, what else did Africa introduce to the world before history changed the labels? Let's cut through the fog. African exploration wasn't just movement, it was exchange. People don't cross oceans for sightseeing, they cross for value. And Africa had plenty. Gold, first of all. Not just raw metal, but systems around it. Measurement, standardization, trade protocols. West African gold didn't stumble into Europe. It was managed, protected, and transported through long-distance networks that predate European maritime dominance. That level of control requires navigation, planning, experience. Then there's knowledge. African travelers didn't move empty-handed. They carried mathematics refined for astronomy, calendrical systems aligned to stars, medical practices grounded in anatomy and herbal science, spiritual frameworks that tied cosmology to governance. This wasn't folklore, it was applied intelligence. And when that knowledge reached new shores, it didn't announce itself as African, it blended. That's why later historians struggle to trace it, because influence that works doesn't stay labeled. Look at metallurgy. African smelting techniques achieved temperatures Europe wouldn't reach for centuries. Steel production in parts of Africa predates European methods. When similar techniques appear elsewhere, the timeline mysteriously resets. Suddenly it's independent development. Convenient. Navigation tools tell the same story. Star-based orientation systems used across Africa align with methods later seen in other regions. Not copied line for line, adapted. That's how transmission works. No one duplicates. They integrate. And agriculture seals the case. Crops don't migrate alone. They require care, knowledge, timing. African plants appearing in distant lands mean African hands were present. That's not symbolic. That's physical. Now here's where the narrative gets slippery. Instead of acknowledging Africa as an exporter, history reframed Africa as a resource. Goods mattered, people didn't. Africa became a place things came from, not ideas. Materials, not minds. That separation was intentional, because ideas demand respect, resources invite extraction. So African contributions were stripped of authorship. Gold became European wealth. Mathematics became Greek revival. Navigation became European genius. Africa disappeared from the credits. But credits matter. They shape who gets studied, who gets funded, who gets remembered. And here's the uncomfortable part. Once Africa is removed as a source, Europe becomes the origin by default. Not because it was first, because alternatives were erased. That's how the world became European-centered. Africa's role wasn't denied outright, it was downsized, localized, decontextualized. This allowed a clean story. Europe rises, others follow. But reality was messier. Africa wasn't waiting, it was moving, trading, teaching, influencing, long before anyone coined Age of Exploration. And the reason this still matters is simple. Modern innovation myths borrow the same structure. Certain people are imagined as natural pioneers, others as passive recipients. That imagination didn't come from nowhere. It was built on edited history. So when African exploration gets acknowledged, it destabilizes more than the past. It challenges who gets imagined as future shapers. And that's where resistance stiffens. Because once you accept Africa exported knowledge globally, the idea of African dependency collapses. And dependency is a useful myth. It justifies intervention, control, narrative dominance. So the story stays incomplete. But here's the thing about exports. They leave fingerprints. Techniques don't vanish. Practices don't unlearn themselves. Systems don't emerge without lineage. And once you start tracing those lineages honestly, Africa keeps reappearing, not as a footnote, as a source, which leads us to the most uncomfortable realization yet. If Africa shaped the world through exploration and exchange, then the modern global order isn't a European invention, it's a takeover. And takeovers only look clean when the original owners are written out. So the question becomes unavoidable. If Africa gave the world gold, science, navigation, and systems, why does the world still pretend Africa gave nothing back? Here's the final lock on the door. Even when people hear the evidence, many still resist it. Not because it's weak, because it feels wrong. And that feeling didn't come from facts. It came from conditioning. For centuries, Africa has been framed as the end of the world, not the beginning of routes, as the place people left, not the place people launched from. That framing didn't happen naturally. It was engineered to make African global movement feel unbelievable on instinct. So when you say Africans crossed oceans first, the pushback isn't academic, it's emotional. Why haven't I heard this before? Why didn't anyone teach this? Wouldn't everyone know? That reaction is the point. Silence creates doubt. Doubt protects the story. Because if African exploration were common knowledge, the modern racial order wouldn't hold. You can't place people at the bottom if they were once everywhere. So the narrative had to do more than erase facts. It had to retrain imagination. Africa was portrayed as landlocked even when it wasn't, static even when it moved, ancient but never advanced, old but never foundational. And once that image sets, everything else sounds like fantasy. Now notice the pattern. When Europeans sailed, it's called bravery. When Africans sailed, it's called coincidence. When Europeans leave artifacts, they're celebrated. When Africans leave artifacts, they're questioned. When Europeans leave written records, they're trusted. When Africans leave oral records, they're dismissed. That's not a double standard by accident, it's by design. Because if Africans are granted the same interpretive generosity as Europeans, the story flips instantly. So instead, impossibility gets baked in. Africans couldn't have built ships. Africans couldn't have navigated stars. Africans couldn't have crossed oceans. Not because of evidence, because of expectation. And expectations are powerful. They shape what scholars look for, what museums display, what documentaries fund, what audiences accept. So African exploration becomes invisible, not because it didn't happen, but because people weren't trained to see it. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Once an idea is labeled impossible, evidence against it doesn't persuade, it threatens. And threatened systems respond defensively. That's why discussions of African global movement get framed as emotional, political, or radical. Not because they are, but because delegitimizing the messenger is easier than revising the timeline. If you make the idea feel extreme, you don't have to disprove it. That's the oldest trick in power maintenance, and it worked for a long time. But here's what changed. Information stopped staying locked. Artifacts are digitized. Records are translated. Disciplines cross-check each other. Independent researchers compare notes outside institutional filters. The walls got thinner, and suddenly, the impossible started looking inconvenient. Because the more people learn about currents, metallurgy, agriculture, and trade networks, the less sense the official story makes. You don't need belief anymore. You need explanation. And explanations are running out, so the resistance shifts again. Now it's not, this didn't happen. It's, why does it matter? That question is revealing, because people only ask, why does it matter when the answer threatens something? And here's why it matters. Because history trains identity. If Africans are remembered as stationary, modern limits feel natural. If Africans are remembered as explorers, those limits look artificial. And artificial limits invite challenge. That's what this truth unlocks. Not pride, permission. Permission to imagine African people as innovators without apology, as leaders without exception, as global without qualification. That's dangerous to any system built on inherited hierarchy. So the truth stays uncomfortable, not because it's weak, because it's powerful. And power always scares those who built themselves by denying it to others. Which brings us to the turning point, because once you understand why African exploration was made to feel impossible, you start recognizing how many other impossibilities were manufactured the same way. And that's when the story stops being about the past and starts becoming about what you've been taught not to imagine next. Here's where the ground actually shifts, not emotionally, structurally. Once you accept that Africans traveled the world first, a lot of modern ideas stop making sense. Not because they're wrong individually, but because they're built on a false starting line. Start with development. Africa isn't underdeveloped, it was over-extracted. That distinction matters. If African societies were already global participants, then later poverty isn't a lack of capability. It's the result of disruption, routes broken, systems dismantled, knowledge chains cut. That reframes everything. Now look at innovation. Innovation isn't a European trait that spread outward. It's a human one that got selectively credited. African navigation proves that brilliance existed outside Europe long before Europe decided brilliance had a look, a language, and a passport, which means modern ideas about who is naturally inventive are inherited bias, not observation. Then there's education. Why do African students learn about European explorers as if exploration started there? Why are African contributions treated as optional electives instead of foundations? Because education follows legitimacy, and legitimacy was assigned, not earned. Accept African exploration and curricula have to change, museums have to change, funding priorities have to change. That's why this truth stalls. Now look at identity. For centuries, Black identity has been shaped around survival, not agency, around endurance, not initiation, around reaction, not action. Exploration flips that. It places African people at the center of motion, not the margins of impact. And that's psychologically seismic, because people who see their ancestors as movers think differently about their own range, their own permission, their own reach. That's why this history feels activating. It doesn't just inform, it unlocks. Now here's the quiet fear underneath the resistance. If African exploration is accepted, then European dominance looks temporary, not destined. And temporary power is easier to question. That's why narratives of inevitability are guarded so fiercely. Once inevitability cracks, accountability follows. So instead of debating evidence, the system debates tone, motives, intentions. Anything except the timeline, but timelines don't argue, they expose. Now consider geopolitics. Modern borders, trade routes, and global influence are still justified by historical precedents. We were there first. We opened the route. We discovered the passage. African exploration disrupts those justifications. It suggests that global connectivity existed before modern empires, which means control wasn't creation. It was takeover. That's not a comfortable conclusion for anyone benefiting from inherited advantage. So the truth stays buried under distraction. But here's the part that can't be stopped. Once people internalize African global movement, they stop asking permission to imagine Africa's future, because futures are built by those who believe they belong there. Explorers don't wait to be invited. And that mindset shift is irreversible. Now zoom out. This isn't about claiming trophies, it's about reclaiming authorship. Africans didn't stumble into history, they shaped it. They didn't wait at the edge of the world, they crossed it. And once that reality settles in, the question changes. It's no longer, did Africans travel the world first? It becomes, how did we get so comfortable believing they didn't? That question doesn't end at oceans. It spreads into science, into theology, into governance, into art, into identity. Because once you spot one edited origin story, you start looking for others. And that's the real legacy of this truth. It doesn't just correct the past, it trains you to interrogate the present. Which brings us to the closing stretch. Because if African exploration was a race to preserve power, what happens when that power no longer controls the story? And who benefits when the world finally remembers who moved first? Here's what erasure never plans for: return. You can suppress a story, you can distort it, you can delay it, but you can't permanently kill something that's true, because truth has gravity. African global movement keeps resurfacing for one reason: too many systems depend on it. Trade routes don't appear out of nothing. Technologies don't emerge without lineage. Cultural similarities don't stack up across oceans by coincidence. At some point, the math stops working. That's why this knowledge keeps breaking through in waves, not all at once, not cleanly, but consistently. One generation finds the currents, another finds the crops, another finds the artifacts, another finds the language links. Different doors, same room, and every time it reappears, it's met with the same reaction. Dismissal first, minimization second, silence third, because outright denial stopped working. Now the strategy is containment. Keep the truth niche, keep it academic, keep it buried in journals. Never let it become common sense, because common sense is dangerous. Once something feels obvious, it stops being debatable. And African exploration is inching toward obvious, not because of belief, because of accumulation. The volume is growing, the gaps are closing, the explanations are thinner, and that terrifies institutions built on old foundations. Because once the public accepts that Africans moved globally first, a lot of authority loses its origin story. Authority doesn't like losing origin stories. That's why you'll notice a pattern. Whenever African global influence gets discussed, the conversation gets redirected. It's complex, it's debated, it's unclear. But complexity isn't confusion, and debate isn't absence. Those words are shields. They buy time, but time doesn't stop evidence. Now here's the part that never gets said plainly. The reason this truth keeps returning is because it aligns with reality as lived by African people today. African diasporas didn't emerge randomly. They follow roots, patterns, currents. The past echoes into the present. And once people notice that echo, the story starts feeling familiar instead of radical. That's when erasure fails. Because familiarity breeds recognition, and recognition breeds confidence, which is why this knowledge scares gatekeepers more than anger ever could. Anger burns out. Recognition spreads. Now think about how many people independently reach the same conclusion without talking to each other. Different countries, different languages, same realization. That doesn't happen with myths. It happens with buried facts. Facts don't need agreement. They just need exposure. And exposure is accelerating. Digital archives, open databases, independent research, cross-disciplinary collaboration. The monopoly on narrative is breaking, which means the story can't be locked anymore, only delayed. And delay has an expiration date. Now here's the final irony. The same system that erased African exploration also trained people to look for it. Critical thinking, source checking, comparative analysis. Those tools were meant to reinforce authority. Instead, they exposed it. Because once you apply those tools evenly, the official timeline doesn't hold. And once the timeline cracks, trust cracks with it. That's why this moment feels different. It's not about convincing skeptics. It's about people independently noticing inconsistencies. And when enough people notice something doesn't add up, the narrative shifts whether institutions approve or not. That's how every historical correction happens, quietly, gradually, then suddenly. So the question isn't whether African exploration will be accepted, it's how long the delay can last. And here's the final pivot. When this truth becomes mainstream, it won't be framed as radical. It'll be framed as obvious. People will ask why it took so long, why it was resisted, why it was hidden, and the answer won't be flattering, because it won't be about evidence. It'll be about power, and power never likes being exposed as borrowed, which brings us to the last step, because once you understand why African exploration keeps coming back, you're forced to ask something even more dangerous. What else was pushed aside for the same reason? And how much of what we call history is really just memory management? Here's what this erasure actually did. It didn't just hide African exploration, it shrank imagination. When a people are written as stationary in history, they're expected to be stationary in the present. Limited movement in the past quietly becomes limited possibility in the future. That's not accidental. That's psychological conditioning, because history doesn't just explain where you came from, it trains you on what you're allowed to become. If Africans are remembered as explorers, builders, navigators of open water, then global ambition feels natural. If they're remembered as landlocked, isolated, and reactive, ambition feels like imitation. That difference changes everything. This is why the fight over African exploration is so emotional. It's not about boats, it's about permission. Permission to imagine leadership, permission to imagine innovation, permission to imagine ownership of space beyond survival. When that permission is denied long enough, people stop asking for it. They internalize the limit. And internalized limits are the most effective kind. That's why this history matters right now. Because modern narratives still mirror the old ones. Africa is portrayed as receiving aid, not exporting ideas, as catching up, not setting pace, as reacting to the world, not shaping it. That framing didn't start in modern media. It started when African movement was erased from the past. Now notice something. Even today, when African excellence shows up globally, it's treated as an exception, a breakthrough, a surprise. The language gives it away. Unexpected, unlikely, against the odds. Those phrases don't describe reality. They reveal expectation. And expectations come from stories. The story that Africans didn't move, didn't explore, didn't initiate. That's the quiet damage. Now flip the lens. Imagine growing up knowing your ancestors crossed oceans, navigated stars, built trade networks, and left footprints on multiple continents. That doesn't create arrogance, it creates grounding. Because people who know they belong in the world don't beg for space in it. They move with confidence. That's the power this history unlocks. And that's why it was suppressed, because suppression isn't about hiding facts. It's about shaping self-perception. The most effective control isn't physical, it's narrative. Now here's the part most people miss. This erasure also harmed Europe, because by claiming sole ownership of exploration, Europe trapped itself in a atatita myth of singular genius. That myth requires constant defense. Any contradiction feels like collapse. That's why discussions of African exploration provoke such strong reactions. They threaten identity, not just information. But identity built on incomplete truth is fragile, and fragile identities lash out. So instead of updating the story, the system doubles down, calls it revisionism, calls it agenda, calls it politics. But politics didn't create the currents. Politics didn't place crops across oceans. Politics didn't carve navigation knowledge into stone. Reality did. And reality doesn't bend forever. Now we're at a turning point. People aren't asking for permission anymore. They're connecting dots on their own. And once that happens, authority loses its gatekeeping role, which is why this moment feels tense. Because tension means something is shifting. The old story isn't holding. The new one isn't fully established. And people are caught in between. That's where change lives. And here's the final truth of this chunk. African exploration doesn't just restore pride, it restores balance. It places Africa back into the global story as a participant, not a prop. As a source, not a side note. And once that balance returns, the world looks different, not divided into givers and takers, but into contributors with shared responsibility. That's a harder world for power to control, which is exactly why it was delayed. So now the question isn't whether this history will be reclaimed, it's who benefits when people finally stop seeing Africa as still and start seeing it as what it always was, in motion. And once you see Africa in motion, what other limits suddenly stop making sense? Here's the direct truth. The reason people say there's no proof Africans explored globally isn't because evidence doesn't exist. It's because the evidence doesn't live in one place, under one flag, or inside one discipline. It's fragmented on purpose. African exploration doesn't show up as a single dramatic moment with a named captain and a painted portrait. It shows up as patterns, and patterns are harder to control. Start with navigation knowledge. Long before Europe standardized ocean travel, African coastal societies understood currents, winds, and seasonal tides, not theoretically, practically. Fishing economies don't survive guesswork. Trade economies don't expand without precision. You don't build maritime networks by accident. Now look at ship technology. Reed boats, sewn plank vessels, and early catamaran-style designs weren't primitive experiments. They were optimized for flexibility, repair, and long-distance movement. These designs appear in Africa early and reappear elsewhere later, improved but recognizably related. Technology migrates with people, not with textbooks. Next, trade routes: gold, ivory, spices, cola nuts, and metallurgical. Knowledge moved across vast distances long before European expansion. That movement required logistics, warehousing, scheduling, coordination across regions. You don't sustain that without reliable travel. And here's the key point people dodge. If Africans were trading inland and along coasts at scale, the leap to open water isn't radical. It's incremental. Exploration doesn't begin with oceans. It begins with confidence in movement. Now, zoom out. Why do crops native to Africa appear in distant lands earlier than official contact dates suggest? Why do architectural techniques echo across continents without clear European intermediaries? Why do oral histories across the Atlantic describe visitors who don't fit later colonial profiles? These aren't coincidences, they're signals. But signals require interpretation, and interpretation depends on who's listening. Western academia trained itself to value written records over lived systems, but African civilizations prioritized memory, apprenticeship, and embodied knowledge. That doesn't make them less reliable, it makes them less legible to outsiders. So when scholars looked for African exploration using European criteria, they concluded it didn't exist. That's not objectivity, that's methodological blindness. Now let's talk maps. Early European maps contained glaring contradictions. Accurate coastlines paired with imaginary interiors, correct distances paired with false labels, knowledge without acknowledgement. That tells you something important. Information was circulating before official narratives admitted it. And here's where the discomfort starts. If Africans explored, mapped, and traded widely, then Europe didn't discover the world. It entered a world already known. That doesn't erase European achievement. It contextualizes it. And context is dangerous to myths built on firstness. This is why African exploration gets framed as fringe, as speculative, as emotional, because admitting it collapses a hierarchy, not just a timeline. Now understand this clearly. No one is claiming Africans dominated every ocean or controlled every route. That's a straw man. Exploration isn't about monopoly, it's about participation. And African participation is undeniable once you stop demanding evidence in a single, sanitized format. History isn't a courtroom, it's a reconstruction. And reconstructions require assembling fragments. Fragments like shared ship designs, shared crops, shared symbols, shared navigational practices. Individually, they're dismissed. Together, they're undeniable. Which brings us to the real reason this conversation is resisted. If Africans traveled widely, then isolation narratives collapse. If isolation collapses, inferiority collapses. If inferiority collapses, justification collapses. and some systems cannot survive without justification. That's the quiet tension beneath this debate. Now here's the uncomfortable flip side. Reclaiming this history isn't about replacing one supremacy with another. It's about removing supremacy entirely from the framework, because once multiple civilizations are recognized as movers, builders, explorers, the world stops revolving around a single axis. That's not threatening, it's stabilizing. But stability doesn't sell power, hierarchy does. So the story stayed distorted, until now. Because today, evidence cross-pollinates faster than gatekeepers can stop it. Archaeology talks to genetics. Linguistics talks to climatology. Oral history talks to material science, and the old silos are breaking. Which means the question is no longer, did Africans travel the world first? The real question is, why were we taught to believe they didn't move at all? Because once you answer that honestly, you stop asking for permission to imagine African agency. You start expecting it, and expectations reshape reality faster than facts ever did. That's why this history matters, not as trivia, not as revenge, but as correction. Because the world doesn't need another myth. It needs a map that finally reflects who was actually moving through it, and Africa was never standing still. Let's finish this cleanly. African global travel wasn't erased by accident. It was erased because it broke a system. Europe didn't just build empires with ships, it built them with stories. And the most important story was this: we arrived first. We figured it out. We led. That story collapses the moment Africans are acknowledged as early ocean movers. Because then Europe isn't the origin. It's a participant that arrived later, faster, and louder, so the past had to be edited. Not crudely, strategically. Exploration history was narrowed. Timelines were compressed. Sources were filtered. Written logs were elevated. Oral systems were dismissed. Not because one was superior, because one was controllable. You can archive paper. You can't archive memory without listening. So African navigation knowledge, taught through apprenticeship, repetition, lived experience, was labeled unscientific. That label did the work. No debate needed. Now look at how discovery is defined. A place only exists once Europe names it. A route only matters once Europe maps it. A people only matter once Europe records them. That's not history. That's branding. And branding requires exclusivity. If Africans were already moving across oceans, then the age of discovery isn't discovery at all. It's expansion into pre-existing networks. That's a demotion. And empires don't tolerate demotions. So the narrative hardened. Africa became isolated, landlocked, internal. Movement was reframed as migration, not exploration. Trade was reframed as coincidence, not capability. Same actions, different framing. Now here's the part most people miss. This erasure didn't just harm Africa. It limited Europe too. Because when you erase shared history, you erase shared credit. And when you erase shared credit, you create artificial divisions. Civilizations don't grow alone. They never have. But the myth of solitary genius is powerful. It justifies dominance. That's why African sailors don't appear in textbooks. Not because they weren't there, because their presence complicated ownership. Now fast forward. Why is this resurfacing now? Because the tools changed. Genetics doesn't care about narratives. It tracks movement. Linguistics doesn't care about borders. It tracks exchange. Archaeology doesn't care about pride. It uncovers patterns. And patterns are ruthless. They show contact where denial insists on separation. They show transfer where isolation was claimed. They show sophistication where simplicity was assigned. The old story can't survive multidisciplinary scrutiny. That's why resistance has shifted tone. It's no longer impossible. It's irrelevant. That's the last defense. If you can't deny it, minimize it. But here's the problem. Movement is never irrelevant. Movement is how the world was built. Every civilization that matters moved, and Africa was no exception. In fact, Africa had one massive advantage early on: proximity. Africa sits at the crossroads of the old world, connected to Asia, facing Europe, bordering vast oceans. The idea that Africans stayed still in the most connected geography on Earth is absurd on its face. Stillness is a luxury of isolation. Africa never had that luxury. So here's the clean conclusion. Africans didn't suddenly start traveling when Europeans arrived. They didn't learn navigation from outsiders. They didn't need permission to move. They were already doing it, quietly, competently, consistently, and because they didn't brand it, monetize it, or mythologize it, others took the spotlight. History rewards the loud, not the accurate. But accuracy has a way of resurfacing, and when it does, it forces a reckoning. Not about guilt, about balance. This isn't about flipping the hierarchy, it's about removing it. Because once you accept that Africans were early global movers, the world stops looking like a ladder and starts looking like a web. Multiple centers, multiple paths, multiple contributors. That's harder to teach, but it's closer to the truth. And truth doesn't care who feels comfortable. So if this makes people uneasy, good. Unease is where correction starts. Africa was never waiting to be discovered. It was already moving. The only thing that changed was who got credit for motion. And now, that credit is being redistributed, not by ideology, but by evidence. That's why this conversation won't go away. That's why it keeps resurfacing. That's why it matters. Not because it flatters Africa, but because it finally puts Africa back where it always belonged, inside the story of the world, not on the margins of it.